It's a privilege to be here, and I'm delighted to be in Northern Ireland. Some of you who I've already had the chance to meet know that I have a sister who lives in Northern Ireland and who is a service user and has been for many years. So I come with an interest in care and services and the whole environment around carers issues in Northern Ireland from a variety of focus and interests. I'm going to talk, as Gillian has said, about some of the work that I'm doing, which is for a new book. And this is one of the first talks I've given about the angle that I'm developing here. So I haven't yet written this book, it's in development, and I've been studying systems in different parts of the world. Obviously I can't cover the whole of the globe, but I'm looking at East Asia, where I'm looking at Japan and Taiwan. I'm not going to say much about those countries today, but I can answer questions about them if you're interested. I'm going to talk about Australia and New Zealand, mainly Australia here today. I've been investigating support around carers and carers organisations' activities in Canada and the USA, and of course the UK and the European context is where I'm obviously most at home and where I know most, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that today as well. So the outline of my talk is really, I'm going to say something about what's being celebrated this year in 2015, which is the 50th anniversary of the carers movement in the UK. And I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment. And then I'm going to say something about bilateral and multinational connections. And I'm going to focus on the International Carers Conferences and the kinds of things that they've focused on. I'm going to talk a bit about European campaigning and policy making and how that's beginning to respond to the claims making and activities of carers organisations. And then I'm going to take as a case example the issue of carers and employment, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a number of countries. Particularly I'm going to focus on Australia and Canada as countries where the relationship between carers organisations based in the UK and carers organisations in those countries has been productive of a change in the way in which carers issues are conceptualised, in which policy has begun to develop, and in some of the things that have been achieved. I think those who currently lead the carers organisations all around the world would be the first to say that there remains much to be done. And none of them is resting on their laurels or happy with the situation that they have helped to create, which is often much better than that which went before, but is by most carers organisations' definition still nowhere near adequate to meet the needs of carers who give so much to others and often suffer the triple penalty, which I've written about based on the work that Gillian referred to, the triple penalty of poorer health, poorer financial circumstances and social exclusion, a penalty which I don't think any of us would feel could be justified in return for giving something freely to others because of your relationship to somebody who has needs arising from disability or illness or frailty. So let me move on to start by talking a little bit about 50 years of the carers movement in the UK. And I start with 1965. Because this is when it all began internationally. This was the first organisation that I've been able to find that was specifically about supporting people who were providing care to others because of the consequences that giving that care had on them themselves. There are organisations which have included support for carers that are older than that, particularly around the needs of older people and people with disabilities, but this was the first organisation. It was actually called the National Association for the Single Woman and Her Dependents. And it emerged from a campaign which began in 1963 when a woman called Mary Webster, who was a minister of religion, or had been earlier in her life, she was a minister in the Congregational Church in England, and she'd given up her ministry to care for her elderly parents. And she'd done that for a number of years. And at the end of that period of caring for her elderly parents, she realised what she had lost. And she realised the very difficult financial circumstances that she found herself in and the difficult life that she was now going to have as a consequence of what she had given to her parents. And she wrote to the Times. And she wrote to the Times and she received an avalanche of mail in return. And she discovered that she wasn't the only one in this situation. And being somebody who clearly was a woman of no small importance, she thought that she wasn't just going to sit back and think, well, lots of other people are in the same boat, so I'll have to put up with it. She thought she would form an organisation, set up and do something about it. But I've given you a quote here from the book which was written by Nancy Kona in 1993, which was actually written to mark 30 years since Mary Webster made that first step of forming the organisation. And her reflections in 1993, I think, are really still very apposite. From the beginning, carers' sense of injustice about their lack of financial recognition has been a driving force behind the carers movement. I've highlighted those phrases because I think those are two things that are really still very important. This sense of injustice, that can't be right that it's like this, and this idea that there's something pushing you to go on and keep going to get actually some better scenario. This has been a movement which has been full of people with passion and energy and commitment and determination and a focus on never giving up, even when campaigns don't work or the things that you hope to achieve you only get modest benefits from. Because always the expectation, the ambition has been greater than what has been achieved at almost every point. Carers who have given up their jobs, lost pension rights and become dependent on benefits feel that they have been financially penalised for taking on the responsibilities of carers. Well, probably most carers would still say that today, but that was what was drawn attention to in 1965. Mary Webster saw clearly, I think this is the key point I want you to bear in mind, that legislation would be needed alongside practical and emotional support if these women's lives were to be changed. So the focus was originally on women, but the key thing here, I think, is that it was always a campaigning organisation. It was always about trying to change the way the state related to carers. It was always about trying to change the law, trying to change policy, as well as to ensure that there were good services available to support people. But it was not initially just about getting those services going. It was about actually addressing it from the perspective of a legal and policy system. Compare underneath the statement that Carers UK has put on its website to mark the 50th anniversary. And I think you will see also the way that the heritage of those two organisations. Carers UK is the inheritor organisation of the National Association for the Single Woman and Her Dependents. That organisation merged it had a variety of names and later became, during a merger with another organisation, the Carers National Association, which later changed its name to Carers UK. So there is a direct link between those organisations. We've been campaigning for carers for 50 years, transforming understanding, so this is about the knowledge that was mentioned in the introduction around ARK, transforming understanding and winning critical developments in carers' rights. And this perspective on rights I think is really important. It's just not about services, it's also about rights, and I think that's important and something that people want to hold on to in what they themselves say are these challenging times. Our work has never been more important as we seek to protect these rights while pressing ahead to break new ground. We are able to speak with authority in our policy and campaigning work because we are grounded in the reality of carers' experiences. So it's a membership organisation. It's built by people whose experience was that this was something they were involved in now or had been doing or had done in the past and had an impact upon them. Backed up with vital evidence through our research. Another link to ARK, knowledge, research, I think was it action. I would add experience actually for this organisation, but I think really important has been right from the very beginning. They knew they had to map what's going on. What happens when this experience happens to someone? We need to understand carers' circumstances. We need to understand who carers are. We need to count them. We need to measure what they do. We need to make our arguments based upon factual evidence about the circumstances in which they find themselves. We ensure carers' voices reach decision makers at the highest level, and I've seen that in action in the last 20 years when I've been actively involved in researching this field, building our research to influence and change policy. So absolutely smack in the tradition of what ARK is trying to achieve. We value working in partnership with others, and we're tenacious in pursuing changes that look impossible. So I think that's really quite an interesting kind of, if you contrast those two positions 50 years apart, I think you can see what an important organisation Carers UK and the organisations with which it's worked in partnership have been. These, I would say, would be obviously not a complete summary, but it's the highlights I would draw attention to of the key achievements of the carers movements in the UK, in which of course Northern Ireland carers organisations have played their part. The first achievement was the achievement of obtaining invalid care allowance in 1976. So this is going back a long time now. That was the first benefit, and it was about getting a little bit of a financial cushion to help offset the income that carers had foregone by giving care to others, by sacrificing either their whole of their income from work or part of their income from work, by reducing their hours, the financial difficulties which carers find themselves in. It's always been about partially offsetting that in the British system. It's not been about what one of the benefits available in the Australian system is about, which is about compensating carers for the costs of caring, which is a debate which didn't inform this particular development. Interestingly, invalid care allowance was at first only available to single women and to men. And it took a campaign that went right to the European Court of Justice, and which was an absolutely critical campaign in terms of pushing carers organisations into the public eye and getting them into the visibility of policymakers. They campaigned incredibly successful around the case of Jackie Drake. And Jackie Drake was actually, I've been digging around in the archives of the carers organisations historically, and she was picked out from the membership list. And the then CEO of the organisation that was the forerunner of Carers UK wrote in her account of this that she went down the list looking for a carer who would be the perfect person to push forward to bring a case, to claim that it was unfair and wrong that married women shouldn't be entitled to receive invalid care allowance. And so they had to make sure that she was somebody who would be willing to be in the public eye, somebody whose circumstances would make her fit properly. There would be no possible question that if she hadn't been a married woman, she wouldn't be entitled. And they had to be certain also that since this was probably going to take 3 or 4 years at least to go forward, that her caring situation wasn't going to evaporate in that period. So it couldn't be somebody who was caring for somebody at the end of life. So that case came through, and married women did win the right. The UK government actually gave them the right on the eve of the decision before it actually came through. But that was a really important development. The first legislative recognition of carers didn't come until 1986, however, so it gives you a sense of how long they had to fight before they really started to impact on the law, which is what they were really always trying to do. 3 successful private members' bills really have transformed the way in which local authorities with the responsibility for social care, and of course some of this goes back pretty close to the period when devolution began, and of course after devolution in the UK to the 4 nations, we see the emergence of some legislation which is only relevant in one of those countries. And so some of this legislation applies only in England as a result of the devolution of health and social care policy to the national administrations, by contrast with employment policy, which of course does not have the same arrangement. But each of those private members' bills was brought by an individual MP who won the chance to bring a bill in the ballot in the House of Commons, which is a regular feature of the way we run things, which some of the people I speak to in other countries find rather amazing, because they don't run their governments in the same way, although interestingly Canada has private members' bills which operate in a very similar way. But each of these really made a difference. Now, none of them fundamentally changed carers' experience, but they gradually began to give them the rights which they were campaigning for. And the Recognition Services Act, the Disabled Children Act, and the Carers Equal Opportunities Act all made piecemeal steps towards the situation which has been achieved through the Care Act 2014 for England, which is that carers today have the right to services. If they're assessed as having needs through the local authority system, then the local authority, as of April of 2015, now has a responsibility to ensure that those needs are met if that carer is eligible for services. So there's a lot of ifs and buts in that, but it will mean a real difference to some carers, and it will be a real set of costs and services that local authorities will have to provide or arrange for others to provide. And so that's been a very long campaign for right. The other thing that the carers movement has been highly visible in, and some of the things which would not have happened without them, are the national carer strategies. And you have a national care strategy in Northern Ireland. The national care strategies were first introduced in 1999, and this was an outcome of campaigning. Be of no doubt, these would not have happened without a carers movement. And the tenacity of the carers movement in having got the first one through and saying, well, in 2008, they were pressing for that for several years, but we need to get this mobilised, we need some money behind it, we need some real change, not just rhetoric, was what was going on in 2008, and getting the coalition government in 2010 to sign up to basically the same strategic aims was, in no small measure a result of carers organisations campaigning effectively together. I've listed some of the other things that I think are important. I won't go through all of those in detail because we'll run out of time. But one of the things also that's been important has been the all-party parliamentary group at Westminster. And a number of these things have been emulated elsewhere. Many of them were the first in the world in Britain. The National Care Strategy, I think the UK was the first country in the world to develop something called a National Care Strategy. There are now National Care Strategies in Australia. The Canadians are talking about them. There are National Care Strategies being developed or campaigned for in all sorts of other parts of the world. Coalitions, partnerships and research have been the underpinning of this organisation, or the different organisations that have made up the carers movement. And all around the world, this is another thing that I see, alliances with organisations that support the old, alliances with organisations that support disabled people, alliances with organisations that are campaigning on mental health or on children with disability. And throughout the history of these organisations, you see how they come together, campaign, break apart, argue, fall out over specific issues, come back together again. This is not a smooth path which has always been harmonious, but it has been absolutely pivotal that at key moments some of these organisations have come together. And I'm going to turn now to say a little bit about the international profile and activities that have evolved over this period that I'm talking about, over this 50-year period. So let's start with the International Carers Conferences, because these have been key moments at which people from different countries have come together to think about, to share knowledge about, to inform each other about new research, and to tell each other about their victories and their failures in campaigning for better services and for rights. And the very first one actually didn't happen until 1998. So from 1965, when they formed the first organisation, we've gone 33 years before they got to this point. So important to think about the timescales here. But this was organised by the Carers National Association, which was the name that Carers UK had in its previous life. It was organised to mark their 10th anniversary of the formation of the Carers National Association. And it was organised at a time when Jill Pitt-Keithley, who's now in the House of Lords and is a Labour peer, was the CEO of the Carers National Association. An incredibly important figure in the whole of the movement, not only in the UK but worldwide. But at that first meeting, there were about 200 people there, and those were the countries that were present. I'm working on finding out more about it because in 1998 nothing was on the internet, so you can only find out the details of all of this by digging through boxes and boxes of archives which are held in Manchester City Library, and I'm only through about 10 of the 42 boxes that I have to go through for my book. 2 years later, the Australians picked up the baton on this, and there was a conference called Share the Care, which was held in Brisbane, hosted by what was then called the Carers Association of Australia, which was the forerunner of Carers Australia, as it's called today. Note that in their report they described 2000 as a critical time for decision makers around the globe. The impetus that was beginning to really resonate with the carers organisations by 2000 was population ageing and the way it was making caring so much more important as an issue than it had even been before. Before they were about campaigning for justice and for rights for people for whom the consequences of caregiving were unfair. By this time, they've started to think about the world is going to look different in terms of its population structure and the expectations of humans in the future, and caring is going to be not only important to those who happen to have to do caring, but the experience of nearly everyone at some point in their lives. So they were starting to campaign on this issue and to say we must engage with decision makers. This became their key aim at this point. 2 years later, the Americans hosted a conference that was led by the National Alliance for Caregiving in the USA. By that time, they'd managed to get 700 participants there, representing 22 nations. But they reported in their document, by now we're onto the internet and you can track down these documents, they reported that the experience in 7 countries dominated discussion. So all of these countries had something to say about the way in which the carers organisations had started to have an impact and where policy on carers was beginning to change. 5 years later in Canada, and this is the first of the conferences that I was personally present at, and there might be people here who were at this conference in Toronto. This was hosted by the Canadian Caregiver Alliance, and it announced the decision to form an international alliance. And although that took some time to take off after that, we do now have an International Association of Caregiver Organisations called IACO, which has now got a secretariat and a lead, and is beginning to actually make waves with some of the supranational organisations like the WHO and the OECD and the ILO and some of the other world organisations, which will be able to have a difference, make a difference. Okay. New Frontiers in Caring in Leeds was a new focus on taking issues out of simply being about health and social care and bringing up technology, financial and legal issues and employment issues. And of course we've got another conference coming up this year which is going to be called Future-Proofing the New Demographics. Quickly to talk about campaigning at the European level. There's now an organisation called Eurocarers, which is a member organisation. Members of Eurocarers are charities or NGOs in EU member states and researchers who work in EU member states. And the first idea for it came out of an EU-funded research project, which set up a pan-European research network on family care back some 12 years ago. But it had its first proper meeting as a planned organisation of NGOs back in 2004 and didn't actually get formally registered and have its first meeting until 2007. But its aim right from the beginning was to be the voice of carers in Brussels as well as at home. So it was to strengthen charities in their own states and to help them to work together to achieve change at the international level. And its focus was on international policy change, and it's currently promoting the idea that there might be an EU carer strategy, which I think is a challenge for it, and its aim is to make carers central to all relevant EU developments in the field of social policy. Alongside this, another important development has been the emergence of an interest group within the European Parliament. So this is a group of MEPs in the Parliament. This was established in 2007 to raise awareness and to ensure carers are considered across all EU policy domains. And it was really the key leader of this is an Irish woman, Marion Harkin, who's one of the most very capable and outspoken and influential MEP in this field, who's worked with other MEPs to really make sure that carers issues are on the agenda of parliamentarians in Europe. And their aims are to use the open method of communication and to work towards a directive on carers' leave, focusing on that because the employment remit is the one in which it's most likely that they will be able to achieve success. So being very canny about the way they approach that. I said I would mention carers and employment as a case example. And I was involved in this because I was a research partner with Carers UK between 2002 and 2007 on their EU-funded project Action for Carers and Employment. And again, here, important to note that Carers UK were the organisation which went to Brussels and said, can we not conceptualise carers as a group for whom it's relevant to give special support to enter the labour market? Because the list of groups of people who could be given special support through EU funds to be activated into the labour market did not include carers until they came along and suggested this. What we now see is that this whole issue around work and care has been picked up in Australia and in Canada and in some other countries. Sweden is, for example, running an Employers for Carers activity at the moment. But Most recently, Carers Australia has really pushed and worked closely with the Australian government, both at the federal and at the state and territories level in Australia, around its campaign called Work and Care, the Necessary Investment. And it's looked at the benefits to carers in the economy and the business case for carer-friendly workplaces. And in those documents, it relies quite heavily upon the UK evidence of those issues. So you can see there a direct link between UK policy making and pressures that are being put into the Australian system. The New South Wales government has recently published its carer strategy for 2014 to 19, and a key aim within that is that carers should have choices and opportunities to participate in paid work, and it is putting some action behind that ambition. In Canada, the federal government, through the Department of Employment and Social Development, I had the opportunity to meet with people responsible for this a few weeks ago when I was over there, has implemented, or is in the process of implementing, the Canadian Employers for Caregivers plan. And that's a panel of employers who are being consulted on workplace practices that support caregivers. It's doing some new analysis of cost benefit of workplace practices, which it's commissioned and which will report next year. And it's undertaking a lot of work to try to identify what mechanisms can be used to ensure that employers sustain their commitments in this area. So this, I would say, is an example of where leadership in the UK context has definitely had resonated around the world. Just very quickly before I close, this is just a slide to give you a bit of a story of the history in terms of the Australian perspective. A little bit behind in time terms, the developments in the UK, but you can see that state-level organisations around carers were beginning to develop in the 1980s and into the 1990s. Some of them had an earlier history in slightly different forms, but basically they began to really get active in that period. And they begin a Carers Awareness Week. Again, you can't help noticing that these are some of these things which are happening there are things that have already started to happen in the UK. And they've introduced a number of new programmes. Note the official launch of Parliamentary Friends of Carers, which bears a very similar resemblance to the all-party parliamentary group on carers in the UK in Westminster. And the right to request flexible working gets introduced just in the same way it does in the UK, as initially a right for parents of disabled children. It gets in on the back of policy around parents, and then it gets expanded to carers in other categories. In Canada, most of the progress occurred in the 2000s, but they have something which we don't have, compassionate care benefit, allocated within their employment insurance scheme. And because they have a differently designed and conceptualised scheme around insurance for workers, they've been able to flex that system to provide a financial benefit for carers, which is quite modest but does make a difference to some carers, and is introduced in Canada, as in some other countries, including Sweden. Carers leave that is paid is connected to terminal illness and the expectation that the person you're caring for will die within 6 months. Quite an interesting development, whereas in Japan, for example, where they have a carers leave, which is partially compensated through a payment for loss of earnings, is not connected to terminal illness, but is connected to significant illness of a person within your family. And actually the Japanese, I think, probably have on paper the most generous scheme of carers leave anywhere in the world, which is quite surprising in a way. Caregiver recognition is beginning to come in, and I mentioned earlier the Employers for Caregivers plan. So to wrap up, what are we seeing here? Well, the common rationales that lie behind these developments in different countries, and obviously there are lots of other countries that we could consider, I've only talked about a few here today, are demography, are issues around gender equality. It's been a huge issue in both Taiwan and in Japan. They've been trying to activate women into the labour market. They want women to be, there are women campaigning for gender equality, all of whom see these issues as part of that debate. The sustainability of systems and how we're going to manage to care in the future for larger numbers of people with care needs. Employers' interests in holding on to their workers and not having lots of middle-aged people drop out of employment. Managing care costs. These are common to all countries that are addressing these issues. The policy options available There probably are a few more than those, but actually these are the ones that are kind of on the table these days for what you could do. You can develop local services to provide more help in caring situations. You can fund carers to quit work. Most governments think that's a bad idea and they don't think they want to spend their money on doing that. You can try to fund carers' leave in special circumstances, but you're going to have to define it because you can't, it'd be very difficult to have a completely open funding of carers' leave when caring might have no identifiable end point. You can focus on flexible employment, which is what the UK system and the Australian systems have been doing. You can offer better support in the workplace, where you can engage with trade unionists and employers to try to push on that. You can focus on emergency situations and say, if your mother falls down the stairs or some dramatic incident happens, you need support. You can use discrimination law, as we've begun to do in the UK, and you can use a human rights approach, which is where the Canadians are going at the moment. Very interesting developments happening there, which they will be talking about in September at the International Carers Conference. So my reflections to close would be about, in relation to policy and practice exchange, would be, and I'll just start with the right-hand side of the slide, because these are the things that I've picked up in talking to key players in different organisations around the world. So the key informants I've interviewed. That they're driven by this idea they've got common cause. They care about each other. They want each other's organisations to succeed. They want to help each other. They're very interested in transnational learning, and some of them have been developed through international mentoring. And for example, Jill Pitt-Keithley, the Labour peer I mentioned, has played a key role in mentoring some other CEOs of carers organisations in other parts of the world. They're interested in the way in which, through getting together and sharing ideas, they get empowerment, they get inspiration, and they can raise their profiles through their international connections. The issues and observations I would make really would be around the need for the systems that you put in place to fit with the wider political system. You can't find a kind of perfect example. This is how to do carer support and just plonk it down in any country. There has to be a resonance with the existing political system. Significant links with other supranational charities have been really important. Alzheimer's, ageing charities, these have been really important. Mental health charities internationally are also big players. Cancer charities, big players in the relationship here. But the universality of the issues is one of the most striking features. And even though cultural context and the differences in families' behaviour and in values, for example, are important, convergence is what I'm beginning to see. Beginning to see very similar policies and arguments developing elsewhere, and I would argue that the carers organisations have been pretty important in the transfer of policy ideas. So I'm going to stop there and give you the opportunity to ask questions or to make observations of your own, and I have included some sources there for any of you that are interested in following up, and you can ask me anything about any of these issues or any of the other countries I've tried to study in developing this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.